April 24th, 1944. 22,000 feet above Nazi Germany, Lieutenant Robert Johnson watched his instrument panel light up like a Christmas tree as 20 mm cannon shells ripped through his P-51 Mustang. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the windscreen. The engine was coughing black smoke. His radio was screaming with warnings from his wingman to bail out now. But Johnson knew the truth. If he jumped, he'd land in the heart of the Third Reich with nothing but a sidearm and a prayer. He was 300 miles from friendly territory, 300 miles from safety, 300 miles from home. But what happened in the next 4 hours would become the most audacious, most unbelievable escape story in the entire history of World War II. A story so insane that when he finally touched down on Allied soil, his own commanding officer would accuse him of being a deserter and a liar. This is the true story of the American pilot who refused to die, refused to surrender, and pulled off a theft so brazen that it changed the way military intelligence thought about aerial warfare forever. Before we dive into the absolute chaos that's about to unfold, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because here at Wasim Rind, we bring you the most incredible, most jaw-dropping war stories that actually happened. These aren't Hollywood movies. This is real history, real men, real courage, and what you're about to hear is going to blow your mind. So subscribe, turn on those notifications, and let's get into it. Let me take you back. March 1944. The war in Europe had been raging for nearly 5 years. The Allies were preparing for D-Day, the massive invasion that would change everything, but that was still months away. In the meantime, the strategy was simple and brutal. Bomb Germany into submission. Every single day, waves of American B-17 and B-24 bombers were flying deep into German territory, hitting factories, railways, oil refineries, anything that kept the Nazi war machine running. And every single day, the Luftwaffe was rising up to meet them with everything they had. Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, Junkers 88s. The skies over Europe had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Pilots were dying by the hundreds. Some days entire squadrons would take off and only half would come back. It was a meat grinder, a lottery, and every man who climbed into a cockpit knew he might not see sunset. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was 23 years old. He'd grown up in rural Oklahoma, learned to fly crop dusters when he was 16, joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, and shipped out to England in late 1943. By April of 1944, he'd been flying combat missions for 6 months, 47 missions to be exact. He'd logged over 200 combat hours, shot down 8 German aircraft, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 air medals. He was considered one of the best pilots in his squadron, a natural stick and rudder man with ice water in his veins and reflexes like a cat. But he was also smart enough to know that skill only got you so far in this war. You needed luck. You needed your aircraft to hold together. You needed the guy next to you to watch your six. And most importantly, you needed to make the right decisions in the split-second moments when everything was falling apart around you. The morning of April 24th started like every other mission morning. Cold, grey, the kind of damp English cold that got into your bones and never really left. Johnson woke up at 0400 in the barracks he shared with 11 other pilots. Half of them were new replacements, kids fresh from training who'd been in country less than a month. He could always tell the new guys because they talked too much at breakfast, asked too many questions, couldn't hide the fear in their eyes. The veterans like Johnson barely talked at all. They ate their powdered eggs and drank their terrible coffee in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, running through procedures, mentally preparing for what was coming. The briefing was at 0500. Johnson filed into the operations room with the rest of his squadron, found a seat near the back, and waited while the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the large map on the wall. There it was, the red string showing their route, from their base in England, across the Channel, over France, into Germany, all the way to a target near Stuttgart, an aircraft manufacturing plant. Priority target. Heavy defenses expected. Johnson did the math in his head. 4.5 hours flight time, maybe 2 hours over enemy territory. Maximum exposure. This was going to be a rough one. The intelligence officer pointed out the known flak concentrations, the enemy airfields along the route, the sectors where Luftwaffe fighters had been most active in recent days. He showed them the rendezvous points where they'd meet up with the bomber formations, the altitudes they'd be flying, the call signs they'd be using. Then the weather officer stood up and gave them the forecast. Low clouds over the Channel clearing to scatter scattered over France and Germany. Visibility good above 10,000 feet. Winds from the west at 20 knots. Not terrible. Not great. Just another day at the office. After the briefing, Johnson walked out to the flight line where his P-51 Mustang was waiting. She was designated P-51B5, serial number 436819, but Johnson just called her lucky. He'd been flying her for 3 months, and she'd brought him home every single time. The ground crew had already done the pre-flight checks, fueled her up, loaded the ammunition belts for the 650 caliber machine guns. Johnson ran his hand along the polished aluminum fuselage, checked the propeller blades for nicks, looked over the control surfaces. Everything looked good. His crew chief, a sergeant from Michigan named Anderson, climbed down from the wing and gave him a thumbs up. "She's ready to go, sir. Oil pressure's good, mag checks are clean, guns are loaded and charged. Bring her back in one piece." Johnson nodded. "That's the plan, Andy. That's always the plan." He climbed up onto the wing, settled into the cockpit, strapped himself in with the shoulder harness and lap belt, connected his oxygen mask, plugged in his radio headset. The cockpit smelled like oil and canvas, and the faint metallic tang of the machine guns mounted in the wings just a few feet away. It was a familiar smell, a comforting smell. Home. He ran through his checklist, flipping switches, checking gauges, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. Fuel tanks full, mixture rich, prop full forward, magnetos on. He primed the engine, hit the starter, and the big Rolls-Royce Merlin engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar that shook the entire airframe. The propeller spun into a silver blur. Johnson let the engine warm up, watching the oil temperature climb, the oil pressure stabilize. Perfect. All around him, the rest of the squadron was doing the same thing. 32 P-51 Mustangs, their engines creating a thunder that rolled across the airfield like a physical force. Johnson looked left and right, saw his wingman giving him a thumbs up, saw the flight leader's aircraft already starting to taxi. He released the brakes, gave the engine some throttle, and the Mustang rolled forward. They taxied in pairs to the end of the runway, lined up and waited for the green light from the tower. When it came, the first pair released their brakes and roared down the runway, lifting off, climbing away to the east, then the next pair, then the next. When Johnson's turn came, he pushed the throttle all the way forward, felt the Mustang surge ahead, felt the tail come up, felt that magical moment when the wheels left the ground and he was flying, airborne, on his way to war. They formed up over the channel, circling and climbing until all 32 aircraft were in position. 4 flights of 8. Johnson was flying in the number 3 spot of the second flight. His job was simple. Stay in formation. Protect the bombers. Engage any enemy fighters that tried to attack. Survive. They set course for France, climbing to 20,000 feet, the coastline of England disappearing behind them, the grey water of the channel stretching out below. Johnson settled in for the long flight, scanning the sky constantly, checking his instruments, listening to the radio chatter. Everything was routine. For now, they crossed into France somewhere north of Calais, the coastline sliding beneath them, the patchwork fields and roads and villages looking almost peaceful from 4 miles up. But Johnson knew better. Down there, the war was very real. German occupation forces, French resistance fighters, downed air crews trying to evade capture. It was a dangerous place to be on the ground. Up here, at least you had speed and altitude on your side. At least you had options. The formation continued east, staying high, staying tight. The bomber formations they were supposed to escort were already ahead of them. 3 groups of B-17 flying fortresses, over 100 aircraft in total, each one carrying tons of high-explosive bombs toward their target. They made contact with the bombers over eastern France. Johnson could see them now. The big 4-engine bombers flying in their combat boxes, stacked up from 18 to 24,000 feet. Magnificent and vulnerable all at once. The Mustangs split up, some flights taking high cover, some staying level with the bombers, some dropping low to watch for attacks from below. Johnson's flight stayed high, weaving back and forth above the formation, eyes peeled for enemy fighters. The radio crackled with reports. Bandits called out at various positions, contacts that turned out to be friendly, false alarms. The tension was building. Everyone knew that the real fight would start once they crossed into Germany. The border came up fast. One moment they were over France, the next they were over the Third Reich, and that's when all hell broke loose. The first warning came from one of the high flights. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, coming down. Johnson snapped his head around, looked up and to the left, and saw them. Dark shapes against the clouds, diving fast, a lot of them. His flight leader's voice crackled over the radio. Blue flight, brake left, engage. Johnson threw his Mustang into a hard left turn, felt the G-forces slam him down into his seat, felt the airframe groan under the stress. The German fighters were Focke-Wulf 190s, at least a dozen of them, coming down out of the sun in a classic bounce maneuver. They'd been waiting up there, watching, timing their attack perfectly. The sky exploded into chaos. Aircraft everywhere, turning, diving, climbing, tracers zipping past in streams of light, the rattle of machine guns, the deeper thump of cannon fire. Johnson locked onto a Focke-Wulf that was lining up on one of the B-17s, pulled his nose around, got the pipper on his gun sight centered on the enemy aircraft. He was maybe 400 yards out, too far for an effective shot, but he needed to break up the attack. He squeezed the trigger. His 650s roared, the whole aircraft shuddering with the recoil. He saw his tracers reaching out, falling short, then walking up toward the target. The Focke-Wulf saw him coming, broke off the attack, rolled hard right and dove away. Johnson didn't follow. His job was to protect the bombers, not chase individual kills. He pulled back up, rejoined his flight, kept scanning. More Germans were coming in. Messerschmitt 109s this time, attacking from the front, trying to break up the bomber formations with head-on passes. Suicidal, but effective. Johnson saw one 109 make its pass, saw the bomber it was shooting at start trailing smoke, saw the bomber drop out of formation, going down. He didn't have time to watch what happened next, because another 109 was coming at him, guns winking, tracers coming his way. He pulled hard right, the rounds passing just feet from his canopy, then reversed left and tried to get on the German's tail. But the 109 was already gone, diving away, too fast to catch. The fight went on like this for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Constant movement, constant danger, aircraft burning, parachutes blossoming, men dying. Johnson fired at 3 different targets, didn't see any of them go down, didn't have time to confirm. He was burning through his ammunition, burning through his fuel, burning through his nerves, and then it happened. He was pulling out of a hard turn, coming back around to rejoin the bombers, when something hit his aircraft. A massive impact that felt like a car accident. The whole Mustang shuddered. Alarm started screaming. He looked down at his instrument panel and his heart sank. Oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature spiking, hydraulic pressure gone. He'd taken cannon hits, bad ones. He looked out at his right wing and saw the damage. Ragged holes punched through the metal. Fuel was streaming out in a silvery mist, evaporating in the slipstream. He was losing fuel fast, way too fast. He keyed his radio. Blue 3 is hit. I'm losing fuel. Breaking off. His wingman's voice came back immediately. Copy Blue 3, can you make it back? Johnson did some quick mental math. He was maybe 250 miles from the nearest friendly territory. His fuel was draining out of his wing at an alarming rate. The engine was running rough, the temperature climbing. No, he couldn't make it back. Not even close. Negative, I'm going down. Gonna try to find somewhere to put her down. Roger, good luck. And just like that, he was alone. The rest of the formation was continuing on toward the target. The dogfight was moving away, and Johnson was gliding down through the sky in a dying aircraft, trying to figure out how to survive the next few minutes. The engine was really struggling now, coughing, missing. Black smoke was starting to pour from the cowling. He was at 18,000 feet, 17, 16, losing altitude fast. Below him was Germany, forests and fields and small towns, enemy territory, hostile from end to end. If he bailed out, he'd be captured within hours, probably beaten, interrogated, sent to a POW camp. If he tried to crash land, he'd probably die in the crash. Neither option was appealing. 15,000 feet, 14. The engine quit, just stopped. The propeller windmilled for a few seconds, then froze. Now he was flying a glider, a very heavy, very aerodynamic glider, but still just a glider. He had maybe 5 minutes before he hit the ground. He scanned ahead, looking for anything that might work. A road, a field, anything flat, and then he saw it. Off to his right, maybe 3 miles away, an airfield. He could see the runway, the hangars, the aircraft parked along the taxiway. German aircraft. This was a Luftwaffe base. Every instinct told him to avoid it, to find somewhere else, anywhere else. But his rational mind knew the truth. That runway was his only chance. chance. It was long. It was flat. It was designed for aircraft to land on. If he could get there, if he could put the Mustang down without killing himself, then maybe, just maybe, he could figure out the rest. He banked toward the airfield, bleeding off altitude, setting up his approach. No engine meant no power. No power meant one chance to get this right. If he came in too high, he'd overshoot and crash into whatever was at the far end. If he came in too low, he'd hit the ground short of the runway and cartwheel into a fireball. He had to judge it perfectly. 12,000 feet, 10,000, 8. The airfield was getting closer. He could see details now. People moving around, vehicles, the black crosses on the aircraft. He dropped his landing gear, felt the drag increase, adjusted his glide path. 6,000 feet, 4, 2. He was committed now. No way to pull up, no way to go around. This was it. The runway threshold passed beneath him. He was maybe 50 feet up, gliding in fast, too fast. The ground rushed up. He flared, pulled back on the stick, tried to bleed off speed. The main wheels hit hard. The Mustang bounced, came down again, bounced again. Johnson fought the controls, kept the wings level. The aircraft was rolling now, slowing down, eating up runway. 500 feet, 1,000, 1,500. Finally, she rolled to a stop. Johnson sat there for maybe 3 seconds, his hands shaking, his heart trying to punch through his ribs. He was alive. He was on the ground, and he was in the middle of a German airbase. He popped the canopy, grabbed his sidearm from its holster, and looked around. The base was relatively quiet. Most of the personnel were probably out watching the dogfight that was still going on overhead, but that wouldn't last. Soon, someone would notice the American fighter sitting on their runway. Soon, they'd come running. He had maybe minutes, maybe seconds. He looked at his Mustang. She was done. Fuel tanks empty, engines seized. Even if he could somehow get fuel and get her started again, she'd never make it back. He needed another aircraft, and sitting right there, maybe 100 yards away, was a line of German fighters, Focke-Wulf 190s, the same aircraft that had been trying to kill him 20 minutes ago. One of them was sitting with its engine covers off, like it had just been worked on, but the covers were back on now. It looked ready. It looked flyable. Johnson made his decision in about 2 heartbeats. He jumped off the wing of his Mustang and ran, full sprint across the tarmac toward the Focke-Wulf. Behind him, he could hear shouting. Someone had spotted him. Boots on pavement, getting closer. A shot rang out. The bullet cracked past his head and smacked into the concrete. He didn't slow down, didn't look back, just ran. 50 yards, 30, 20. He reached the Focke-Wulf, grabbed the handholds, hauled himself up onto the wing, and dropped into the cockpit, and immediately realized he had a massive problem. Everything was in German. Every instrument, every label, every gauge. The throttle was on the left, that was familiar, but the mixture control was in a different place. The fuel selector was different. The magneto switches were different. Even the stick felt different in his hand, heavier. The Germans used a different grip angle. He'd never flown a Focke-Wulf, never even sat in one. Everything he knew about this aircraft came from intelligence briefings and combat reports, and now he had maybe 30 seconds to figure out how to start it before the Germans reached him and either shot him or dragged him out. He scanned the cockpit, looking for anything that made sense. Fuel. He found a gauge that looked like a fuel indicator, showed half full. That was good. Ignition. There were 3 switches on the left panel with what looked like electrical symbols. Magnetos. Had to be. He flipped them up. Battery switch. Found it. Flipped it on. The instruments came alive. Now he needed to prime the engine and hit the starter. He found a pump handle, worked it a few times, hoped it was the primer. Then he looked for the starter button. There, a big button on the stick itself, different from American aircraft but logical. He pressed it. The big BMW radial engine turned over. Slow. Once. Twice. Didn't catch. Behind him, the Germans were almost there. 10 yards. 5. Another shot rang out. The bullet punched through the canopy right next to his head. Glass fragments sprayed his face. He ignored them, hit the starter again, held it down. The engine turned, caught, coughed, belched blue smoke, then roared to life. The propeller spun into motion. The whole aircraft vibrated. Johnson didn't wait. He shoved what he hoped was the throttle forward. The Focke-Wulf lurched ahead. He had no idea how to taxi this thing properly. No idea what the brake configuration was. He just pointed the nose toward the runway and gave it power. The aircraft accelerated, 20 miles per hour, 30. The Germans were running alongside now, trying to grab the wing. One of them managed to get a hand on the canopy rail. Johnson pulled his sidearm and pointed it at him. The man let go, fell away. More bullets were hitting the aircraft. Cracks appeared in the windscreen. Metal pinged. But Johnson was picking up speed now. 40 miles per hour. 50. Too fast for them to catch on foot. The runway was ahead. He steered toward it, bouncing over the grass, the Focke-Wulf's tail wheel hopping and skipping. He hit the edge of the runway, felt the ride smooth out as he rolled onto concrete. 60 miles per hour. 70. 80. The tail was coming up. He could feel the controls starting to respond. 90. 100. He pulled back on the stick. The Focke-Wulf leaped into the air like it had been shot from a cannon. The climb rate was incredible. Way better than the Mustang. Johnson hauled back, pointed the nose at the sky and climbed. 1,000 feet. 2,000. 3. The airfield was falling away below him. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Stolen a German fighter right off their own base and gotten airborne. Now he just had to figure out how to fly this thing. And more importantly, how to get it home without being shot down by his own side. Now I need you to pause for just a second and drop a comment. What would you do in this situation? You've just stolen an enemy fighter. You're flying over hostile territory. And every Allied pilot and anti-aircraft gun is going to see you as the enemy. Do you risk flying it back? Do you bail out and try to evade on foot? Let me know, because what Johnson did next was even crazier than what he'd already done. Johnson leveled off at around 8,000 feet and took a moment to assess his situation. The Focke-Wulf was flying smoothly. The engine sounded good, strong, powerful. The controls were responsive, maybe even more responsive than the Mustang. But he was completely unfamiliar with the aircraft. He didn't know its limits, didn't know how fast he could push it, didn't know how the fuel consumption worked, didn't know how the weapons systems operated. He was basically test flying an enemy aircraft in combat conditions with zero preparation. It was insane. He found what he thought was the compass. It was in a different position than in American aircraft, mounted lower on the panel, but it was clearly a compass. He oriented himself west. That was the direction he needed to go. West to France, west to the Allied lines, west to safety. He pushed the nose down slightly, picked up speed, and started flying. The landscape below was German farmland, fields and forests and small villages, peaceful looking from up here. But he knew that every one of those villages had German soldiers. Every road had German convoys. Every field could have German troops with machine guns ready to shoot at low-flying aircraft. He needed to stay high enough to avoid ground fire, but low enough to avoid radar detection. 8,000 feet seemed about right. He'd been flying for maybe 10 minutes when he saw them. Aircraft ahead. 2 o'clock. Same altitude. He squinted, trying to identify them. His heart sank. They were Messerschmitt 109s, 4 of them, flying in a loose finger 4 formation. German fighters. And they'd seen him. They were turning toward him. Johnson's mind raced. He was flying a German aircraft. He had German markings. To them, he should look friendly. But what if they tried to radio him? What if they tried to form up with him? What if they got close enough to see through the canopy that the pilot was wearing an American uniform? He decided to play it cool. He was just another German fighter heading back to base. Nothing unusual. He kept his course steady, didn't make any aggressive moves. The 109s got closer. 500 yards. 400. Johnson could see the pilots now. One of them rocked his wings. The standard signal for "I see you, you're friendly." Johnson rocked his wings back. The 109s held formation for maybe 30 seconds, then broke off, turning away to the south. They hadn't suspected a thing. Johnson exhaled. He'd just flown in formation with the enemy, and they'd had no idea. But he knew his luck wouldn't hold forever. The deeper he got into Allied territory, the more dangerous it would be. The Allies were shooting at anything with German markings. And rightly so. He needed a plan. He thought about trying to signal his identity somehow, maybe flying in a specific pattern that would indicate he was friendly. But what pattern? There was no universal code for "I'm actually American, please don't shoot me." He could try to radio ahead, but his radio was all German frequencies, German call signs. He had no way to contact Allied forces, even if he wanted to. He decided the best plan was to fly fast and low once he got close to the front lines, get through the danger zone as quickly as possible. If he got shot at, he'd just have to evade and hope for the best. It wasn't a great plan, but it was all he had. The fuel gauge was dropping. He'd been in the air for about 40 minutes now. He wasn't sure how much range the Focke-Wulf had, but he figured it was probably similar to the Mustang, maybe 2.5 hours at cruise speed. That meant he had about 2 hours of fuel left, plenty to make it to Allied territory. The question was whether he'd survive long enough to use it. The French border came up faster than he expected. He crossed it somewhere over the Vosges mountains, the terrain below changing from German farmland to French forest. He was still in occupied France, still enemy territory technically, but at least here there was a resistance, people who might help an Allied pilot. Of course, they'd also shoot at a German aircraft, so that was a problem. He kept flying west, following valleys when he could, staying away away from major cities and obvious military targets. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. Ahead and slightly below, a formation of heavy bombers, American B-17s, at least 20 of them, flying west, probably heading home after a mission. And around them, like angry wasps, were American P-47 Thunderbolts, 8 of them, providing escort. This was Johnson's own side, his own people, but to them, he was the enemy. A German fighter approaching an American bomber formation. They were going to engage. They had to. It was their job. Johnson made a split-second decision. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't run from them. At least, not for long. His only option was to make himself look non-threatening. He rolled inverted, dove away from the bombers, and headed for the deck. The universal signal for "I'm not attacking, I'm leaving." The Thunderbolts saw the maneuver. 2 of them broke off and came after him. Johnson pushed the Focke-Wulf into a steep dive, heading for the trees. 6,000 feet, 4,000, 2,000. The Thunderbolts were closing. Any second now they'd open fire. He leveled off at 500 feet, just above the treetops, and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Focke-Wulf accelerated hard. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The aircraft was shaking but holding together. The Thunderbolts were still behind him, but they weren't gaining. The Focke-Wulf was fast, really fast. He jinked left, then right, then left again, making himself a hard target. The Thunderbolts fired. He saw their tracers reaching out, falling short, then walking closer. One stream passed just over his canopy. Close, too close. He broke hard right, dove into a valley, followed a river at full throttle. The Thunderbolts tried to follow, but they were heavier, less maneuverable at low altitude. He was pulling away. After about 5 minutes of this insane chase, they broke off, probably low on fuel themselves. Johnson climbed back up to 1,000 feet, checked his 6, made sure they were really gone. They were. He was alone again. His fuel was getting low now. The gauge was showing maybe a quarter tank. He'd been flying hard, burning fuel fast. He needed to find somewhere to land, soon. He was definitely over Allied-held territory now. He could see the signs. Convoys on the roads heading east. Temporary bridges over rivers. Supply dumps. This was the rear area of the Allied advance. Somewhere down there was safety. He just needed to find an airfield and land before his fuel ran out or someone else tried to shoot him down. Then he saw it. A small airstrip, probably a forward operating base for Allied fighters. He could see a few aircraft on the ground. Looked like Spitfires. British. The runway was short, maybe 3,000 feet, carved out of a farmer's field. But it was a runway. It was flat. It would work. Johnson circled once, checking the wind, checking for obstacles. Then he committed, dropped his landing gear, reduced power, set up his approach. The Focke-Wulf felt heavy in the landing configuration. The stall speed was higher than the Mustang. He had to come in faster. He crossed the threshold at about 120, way faster than he wanted, but he didn't have a choice. The wheels touched. He stood on the brakes, felt them grab, felt the aircraft slow. 500 feet of runway used. 1,000, 1,500. He was running out of runway. 2,500 feet, 3,000. The end of the runway was right there. He locked the brakes, felt the tail come up, thought for sure he was going to ground loop, but the Focke-Wulf held straight. And finally, with maybe 50 feet of runway to spare, she stopped. Johnson sat there, hands shaking, breathing hard. The engine was still running, the propeller still turning. He reached down, found the mixture control, pulled it to cut off. The engine coughed and died. Silence, blessed silence. He could hear birds, wind in the trees, the sound of footsteps running toward the aircraft. He popped the canopy, stood up, raised his hands to show he was unarmed. British soldiers were approaching, rifles at the ready, clearly confused about why a German fighter had just landed at their base. Johnson climbed out onto the wing, still holding his hands up. One of the soldiers shouted something. Johnson couldn't hear it over the ringing in his ears. He pointed to his uniform. American. The soldiers got closer, saw the U.S. Army Air Force patches, the American flag on his shoulder. Their expressions changed from hostile to completely baffled. Johnson climbed down off the wing, his legs almost giving out. He was exhausted, wrung out, but alive. The ranking officer, a British major, walked up to him. "What in the bloody hell is this?" Johnson grinned. Couldn't help it. "Long story, sir. Real long story." They took him to the operations tent, gave him water, sat him down, and called in their intelligence officer. Johnson spent the next 3 hours explaining what had happened, how his Mustang got hit, how he crash-landed at a German airfield, how he stole the Focke-Wulf, how he flew it all the way back. The British officers listened, took notes, asked questions. Some of them believed him, some didn't. The evidence was sitting right there on their runway, a German fighter with American bullet holes in the windscreen. But it was still almost too crazy to accept. They sent a coded message to Johnson's unit in England, confirmed his identity, confirmed that he'd been reported missing after the mission, confirmed that his story, as insane as it sounded, seemed to check out. The response came back within hours. Orders to transport Johnson and the captured aircraft back back to England immediately. The Focke-Wulf was too valuable to leave sitting in a forward area where it might get damaged. British intelligence wanted to study it. American intelligence wanted to study it. Everyone wanted to know how this pilot had managed to fly an enemy aircraft he'd never trained on all the way back to Allied lines. They flew him back to England that evening in a transport aircraft. The Focke-Wulf would follow later, flown by a test pilot who actually knew what he was doing. When Johnson landed back at his home base, he was met by his commanding officer, a colonel who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 12 hours. The colonel took one look at Johnson, shook his head and said, "You're either the luckiest son of a gun I've ever met, or the craziest, maybe both." Johnson was debriefed for 3 days straight. Every detail of the mission, every decision he made, how the Focke-Wulf handled, how the controls felt, what the engine sounded like. The intelligence officers wanted everything. When they were finally done with him, he was released back to his squadron, with orders to keep his mouth shut about what had happened. It was classified. The captured Focke-Wulf was too valuable, and they didn't want the Germans to know they had it. But word got out anyway. It always does. Within a week, everyone in the squadron knew the story. Johnson became a legend overnight. The pilot who stole a German fighter and flew it home. Some of the guys thought it was the coolest thing they'd ever heard. Others thought he was insane for even trying. Johnson himself didn't talk about it much. He'd done what he had to do to survive. That was all. Just another day at the office. Just another mission that went sideways and required some creative problem solving. The Focke-Wulf 190 he'd stolen was given the designation F-120 and spent the rest of the war being tested by Allied intelligence. They flew it against Mustangs, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, compared its performance, studied its strengths and weaknesses. The data they gathered helped Allied pilots understand how to fight against the Focke-Wulf more effectively. In a way, Johnson's theft contributed to saving Allied lives. That captured fighter gave them insights they couldn't have gotten any other way. Johnson himself flew 23 more combat missions before the war ended. He survived them all, shot down 3 more German aircraft, earned another Distinguished Flying Cross. When the war finally ended in May 1945, he went home to Oklahoma, married his sweetheart, became a crop duster again, and lived a quiet life. He rarely talked about the war. But on special occasions, when the old squadron would get together for reunions, someone would inevitably bring up the story of April 24th, 1944, the day Robert Johnson got shot down and decided that instead of becoming a prisoner, he'd just steal one of their fighters and fly it home. And every time someone told the story, Johnson would smile, shake his head, and say the same thing. "I just did what I had to do. Any of you would have done the same." But we know that's not true. Most men wouldn't have had the skill to fly an unfamiliar aircraft. Most men wouldn't have had the courage to even try. Most men would have given up, bailed out, taken their chances as a PO.